The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today's going to be bittersweet because we have, what's sweet about it is we have Jerald Podair coming back to talk about the City of Dreams, Dodger Stadium, and the birth of modern Los Angeles. And, of course, those of you who follow the show know that this is probably the seventh or eighth time Mr. Podair has been on the show, and every time he's been on, it's been good for ratings. It's been great going through this wonderful book, and today, unfortunately, here's the bitter part, we're going to be ending it because we've pretty much gone through the whole book. And as I tell my listeners, as I tell people who comment on my show, it's a very important topic, something that a lot of people, even I didn't know the nuances and all the intricacies that went in and all the pitfalls that Walter O'Malley and the Dodger organization had to endure. And this book sums it up. Because of this book, Jerald's won the infamous, it's great, the Seymour Medal Award for Best Baseball Book by Saber. I can't tell you enough how I loved it when I read it, how I love it after a year, how it's won awards. Go out, get this book. You won't be disappointed. It reads like a novel, very easy reading, very pleasing to the eye. You'll learn a lot, and it deserves the Seymour Medal, honor by Saber. That's just my opinion, and of course I'm going to break for station identification. You are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. And folks, hey, the network has just gone on to Sports Byline overnight, USA. The whole network has gone pretty much public. You catch Ralph's show, Comfortably Zoned, in a vat of pine tar. I love that, a vat of pine tar. And, the network's just growing. We got Bill Kashadas out in Philadelphia. Peter Golenbach still is doing his work. In Golenbach's University, we got Hal Bach doing vintage sports. We got Nancy Finley out in Oakland. There's just so many good shows. We got the Hot Stove with Lenny Randall. It's just an amazing network, and I am just blessed that they were able to pick up my show, and so that we can have great discussions like we're going to have with Mr. Podair. I'm going to call him Professor Podair because he.
I always like to be called Professor Podair. I worked for a PhD for years and years, so it's always nice to be called Professor.
The heck with that! I would call you Doctor. That's what I do. My title is Dr. Ian S. Kahanowitz, MST. That's Masters of Science in Taxation. JD is Doctorate, Esquire. So without any further ado, let's get into it. All right. Now, Gerald, last time, the 1960 elections, we got a problem with Sam Yorty coming up because he decided to go against Kennedy and endorse Nixon, a Democrat, and now he ran as a populist. And now the whole balance of this whole, Dodger Stadium is, again, looking pretty sour on this 1960 election.
Yes, it does, and Sam Yorty is a fascinating political character. There are a lot of attempts today to compare various political characters from the past to Donald Trump, and they don't always work. But I'd say that Sam Yorty had a little bit, maybe even more than a little bit, of Donald Trump in him. He is a populist. He is someone who represents what we were calling the folks, the middle class and lower middle class white residents of Los Angeles, not the people who ran the city from downtown, the downtown establishment, not the wealthier people who lived on the west side, who were Democrats, more liberal, but the solidly conservative, both culturally and economically, folks who lived in places like the San Fernando Valley, which would be, I think, for our listeners who are from the East and maybe familiar with New York, would be more like the Long Island of Los Angeles, a place where there were new suburban homes being built. Sometimes, in Long Island, they would build them in old potato fields. Here, they would build them on old orange groves or orange farms. And these are people who are not oriented towards downtown, many of whom have never even been to downtown. And Sam Yorty is almost the perfect example of these folks because he comes to Los Angeles from Nebraska, as so many of these folks do, coming from the Midwest in 1927, and he basically spends the next 30 years in and out of various elective offices in the Los Angeles area. And it's amazing to me in looking at his life how many different offices he held or ran for before he ran successfully for mayor in 1961. He was a congressman for a while. He ran for the assembly. He ran for the mayor. Ran for mayor. I think he also ran for either lieutenant governor or governor. He ran and ran and ran and mostly lost because he didn't have a lot of money. He didn't seem to be very sophisticated, and he was not plugged in to either the downtown Republican-oriented establishment in L.A. or the liberal Democratic West Side establishment, and that's where the money was and that's where the power was. So as he makes his probably last run for office in the spring of 1961 for mayor, he is definitely a long shot. He's a long shot largely because Norris Paulson, who is the two-term mayor of Los Angeles, after some initial hesitation, is now running for a third term. And he has everyone with power behind him. He's got the newspapers behind him. He's got the labor unions behind him. He's got Hollywood behind him. He has the downtown establishment behind him. Paulson is the member of the downtown establishment, basically the leader. He even has Democrats behind him because, as you said initially, Ian, while Yorty is nominally a Democrat, he is truly a renegade Democrat and has more altercations and disputes with the Democratic leadership of both the city and the state than he does with the Republicans. And so it's not surprising that in 1960, Yorty endorses a Republican, Richard Nixon, over a Democrat, John Kennedy, for the presidency. Now, the next year, 1961, when he's running for the mayoralty, the Democrats are extremely unenthusiastic about Yorty because he's turned on them many times, because he's difficult, because he's an outsider. So it looks like Yorty has no chance to win. First, in the primary, and to let your listeners know, the primaries and elections in Los Angeles are officially nonpartisan, meaning you can't run as a Republican or a Democrat. You run nonpartisan. Now, of course, most people who follow politics know whether you're a Republican or Democrat, but you can't say that. So in the primary, Yorty runs against Mayor Paulson and also against Councilman Patrick McGee, who is actually also from the San Fernando Valley, also an opponent of the Dodger Stadium deal, but much younger and much more charismatic than Yorty, who had been around the track, a number of times. So it looks like he was not going to do well at all. But he gets lucky in the primary and also in the general election. And as I'm always telling my students, it's better to be lucky than to be good. He gets lucky in the primary because Patrick McGee runs a very poor campaign. At the beginning of the campaign, a radio host named George Putnam on KTTV radio asks both McGee and Yorty to appear on his program for just 5 minutes a day as you get the run up to the primary, and that's basically free publicity and a free platform. McGee does it once or twice and then says, I can use my time better. Well, Yorty, who doesn't have any money or doesn't have much money, makes use of George Putnam's show for basically free campaign advertising. And what that does is it squeaks him into second place when the primary vote is held. Paulson gets the most, about 40%, 39-40%, but Yorty comes in second, just edging out Patrick McGee, who probably wishes that he had taken up that offer to get free airtime on TV because they could have debated, or on radio because they could have debated. And so now Yorty is in with Paulson in the runoff. Then he gets lucky again. Paulson comes down with laryngitis. And, of course, the worst thing for any candidate is laryngitis, especially Paulson, who is getting on in years. And throughout the regular campaign, Paulson appears to be sort of an old, tired man who can't even find his voice. And Yorty basically walks all over him. He ends up winning the election, another close one, but he does win. And ironically, for the future of Yorty in politics, it's African American votes that put him over the top. Yorty, during the campaign, criticized the Los Angeles police, the notorious William Parker, a very, very efficient but also a very brutal police commissioner who was not popular in the African American communities. Yorty criticizes Parker and criticizes his boss, Paulson, and implies that if he's elected mayor, Paulson is going to be out. So African Americans, as well as the folks, vote for Yorty. It's an interesting political alliance. Middle and lower middle class whites vote for Yorty, and African Americans vote for Yorty, and Yorty wins. And that makes Walter O'Malley very nervous, because another of the things that Yorty was saying during the 61 campaign is he didn't like the Dodger Stadium deal. He was critical of public aid to a private individual, and while it probably would have been difficult for Yorty to completely void the Dodger Stadium contract when he took office in July 1961, the stadium was pretty much far along. He could have really, really made it difficult to finish the stadium, building inspectors, a refusal to grant highway rights, all sorts of taxes, real estate taxes. There are all sorts of things that Yorty could have done and basically was threatening to do as O'Malley desperately tried to finish the stadium in time for the opening day, which would be April 10th, 1962. But once Yorty gets into office, he does a very curious thing. He's elected as an outsider. He's elected as someone who is hostile to the downtown business establishment, and he says, I'm going to throw those rascals out. Well, as is so often the case in politics, once he gets into office, Yorty makes his deal with the downtown business establishment. Now, you would say, why would he do that? Well, Sam Yorty isn't really an ideologue so much as he is a power seeker. And once he gets into office, he realizes that he's going to need those downtown business people if he wants to win a second term. And this is someone who was already planning to run again in 1965 the minute he takes office in 1961. And in fact, Yorty ended up serving 3 terms as mayor from 61 to 73. So he decides he's going to make his peace with the downtown establishment. And one of the parts of that peace is he is going to basically let the Dodger Stadium deal go through. He's not going to harass them. And the big moment comes only a couple of weeks after he's inaugurated in late July, because there's a big dispute over an access road that Dodger Stadium basically needs from the Pasadena Freeway to the stadium. It's going to cut through Elysian Park, which is, I think, the biggest park in Los Angeles, along with Griffith Park, probably the most important park. And it's going to be a road that is going to go through a public park, so it's very controversial. And initially, Yorty says, well, I'm not going to allow this. It's a misuse of public resources. But in late July, he meets with other public officials and O'Malley, and I've always wondered what happened in that meeting, because there are no notes or there's no minutes as far as I could tell. But when they come out of the meeting, Yorty says, if I were mayor when this contract for this road going through Elysian Park was signed, I probably would have vetoed it. But I can't veto it now, so I'm not going to do anything to oppose it. And of course, the road goes through, and that's the crucial element in terms of making sure that Dodger Stadium is not only built, but that people can get to it. And of course, in Los Angeles, access automobile access is absolutely essential. So in many ways, Sam Yorty saves the day for Walter O'Malley, even as he comes into office saying that these are exactly the kinds of projects that I am going to oppose. So Yorty is a very, very interesting character. In many ways, he sells out the folks that he claimed to represent during the campaign, because downtown Los Angeles under Sam Yorty undergoes a tremendous period of growth. You get Dodger Stadium, you get the Music Center, which still stands, Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, that goes up in 1965. And when Sam Yorty leaves office in 1973, downtown Los Angeles looks a great deal different than it did in 1961 when he assumes office. And that's basically what he promised not to do. In other words, he promised to represent the interests of the people who lived in the San Fernando Valley, not the downtown business establishment, but he ends up basically making his peace with downtown and making his peace with Walter O'Malley, and on April 10th, 1962, with Sam Yorty in attendance, Dodger Stadium opens.
And you know what's interesting? Because even when it was a sign of things to come, because Yorty was called like the Mad Mayor, and
oh yeah, he definitely had a reputation of being a crank.
Yeah, and it just didn't work well with John Holland, who continued the fight. But then with the building and it's going to go on. One of the things is that access road, and I think O'Malley agreed to pay for the access road to the stadium.
I mean, that was the only way that he could get things done. Now, what had happened earlier was the county of Los Angeles had set aside, I think it's $2.4 million for access roads. They raised the gasoline tax, or it was out of the gasoline tax money. The county would put up $2.4 million for access roads, but that wasn't enough. And rather than say, all right, well, I'm going back to the county for more money, O'Malley just said, look, I've got to just pay this out of my own pocket because this stadium has to get built. And that's what he ends up doing. The idea that somehow Los Angeles built a stadium for Walter O'Malley is just it's not only not just untrue, it's almost ludicrous, it's almost a joke, because even with what O'Malley received from the city for land, for highway, for excavation, he ended up having to pay a lot of money out of his own pocket to buy parcels of land, to finish the job on the roads, even for excavation for and land grading for the stadium. So, to say, well, he got free land and then had to build the stadium itself is not really true. He had to build the stadium himself, but he didn't really get free land either. There was a good amount of money he had to pay out of his own pocket, which he ended up doing, because although in the last couple of months before the stadium opened in early 1962, O'Malley was publicly expressing confidence that the stadium would be ready for April 10th. He knew it was going to be a really, really close call. It was raining a lot. He had a crane collapse on him, which delayed the project. Even the night before the stadium was to open, the grass was not completely green because it just hadn't grown in properly, and they had to paint it green. They were painting the fences of the stadium literally at like 8 or 9 o'clock at night before the stadium opened, so that the fences would have some sort of color. So it was a really, really close call to get this stadium built for April 10th, 62. And if he didn't, he really didn't have much of an alternative, because his contract with the LA Coliseum had ended. So I'm actually not sure what he even would have done if the stadium was not ready. He probably would have had to play his games on the road for a month or two, which obviously would have been awful. But it was a near thing. A lot of times when historians look at this whole story, they interject a sense of inevitability to it. In other words, once Walter O'Malley went out to Los Angeles, everything was fine, everything went smoothly, and it was inevitable that Dodger Stadium be built. Well, one of the themes of my book is that it was not inevitable that this stadium be built, that there were many contingencies and many crises, any one of which could have derailed this entire project, and that it was a very near thing, even at the very end. This stadium was probably one of the most hard-won projects that we'll ever see in baseball or even in sports generally.
And, you know, you had, like you mentioned, the cranes. But here's something I didn't know. You know, again, you know, O'Malley was into horticulture. And he had this vision here.
Yeah.
He had this vision, and the city of Los Angeles is like, well, you know what, the heck with you. We want a $1.8 million fee for the water line installations and all this other stuff.
Yeah, there, you know, and again, this is all hard bargaining. The city and, you know, Yorty knew that O'Malley had to have this stadium, and he had to have it by April 10th. And so they're able to throw these things in. But, you know, O'Malley was actually, he was very imaginative and creative, and I think he was very good at, you know, that saying, when you're given lemons, make lemonade. Well, even this in terms of the horticultural part, you know, he was an amateur orchid grower. He was a horticulturalist personally, and he decided that he wanted to have flowers and horticulture at Dodger Stadium and in the surrounding area. And so, you know, again, out of his own pocket, he paid for all of this. And when people visited Dodger Stadium in the 1960s, many times they would remark almost immediately about that alone, or apparently alone among major league ballparks, it had flowers. And, you know, one of the reasons O'Malley wanted to do this is he wanted Dodger Stadium to be a family-oriented venue, which, you know, Ebbets Field, for all its glories, was not. You always get the sense there's no way to confirm this statistically, because they didn't do that in those days. But I got the sense that in 1955, let's say, the typical Brooklyn Dodger fan in Ebbets Field was a male fan, probably sitting alone or with a group of other males who was maybe 25 to 30 years old. That's your typical Brooklyn Dodger fan at Ebbets Field. But your typical Dodger Stadium fan in Los Angeles was probably the father of a couple of children who were in tow with his wife, a family unit. In other words, they weren't loners. They weren't like lone males. They were family units, and that's what O'Malley wanted. And he especially paid attention to female fans. He wanted them to be comfortable, and he wanted them to come to Dodger Stadium because he knew that if mothers came, then the kids would come. Okay, and that would mean if the kids came, that means they would see the Dodgers for the first time in this beautiful stadium when they were 6 or 7, and they would be fans and customers for life. And so O'Malley wanted that. And one of the reasons behind the horticulture was to make the stadium friendly and open, for families and also for female fans, because he knew, this is the culture of the early 1960s, that if a wife came to Dodger Stadium for a game, even if she wasn't a fan, she was going with her family, going with her kids, she would immediately be attracted by the fact that they had flowers all over the place, that it was just pretty and just a pleasant venue. And that's what he wanted to do. That was his intention. He wanted it to be different from Ebbets Field.
Now, the rain was so horrible, like you mentioned. It was really bad that they didn't even know if they were going to, have enough time to finish this project.
Well, when it rains in Los Angeles in January and February, often it rains. It can be really bad. At least it's not snow, but it is hard rain. And he just didn't have the days to spare. He was doing things like flying helicopters over the field with their blades whirring in a form of an attempt to dry the field in that way. So it was very difficult to do that, and of course, then the structure of the stadium is going up. But I think by January and February, it wasn't even so much a problem with the structure, the superstructure of the stadium, but basically getting the field in place. It's not the simplest thing, and doing this book made me not necessarily an expert in matters relating to land grading and grass planting and things like that, and the use of concrete in structures. But I certainly know more about it now than I did when I started the book.
Well, the research is unbelievable. I mean, anyone who tackles this project would learn stuff not only about the building but the whole political thing, not only in Los Angeles but New York, and you get a whole history of Robert Moses and what he had to go through with Moses and the whole New York, the New York.
Oh yeah. In fact, I end my book, or one of the endings of the book is the groundbreaking for what becomes Shea Stadium in New York, because that's the stadium that Moses offered O'Malley in Queens. O'Malley didn't want that because it was a city-owned stadium and because it was not in Brooklyn. But in 1961, the ground is broken for Shea Stadium in New York, and at the end of the book, I quote from Moses's remarks at the groundbreaking, and the arrogance of Moses, I think, really comes through in this speech. It's overblown, it's hyperbolic, it's very self-referential, and I think the readers will get an idea of how difficult it must have been for O'Malley to deal with someone like Robert Moses, who really was at that point the power broker of the Robert Caro book title of that legend. Moses was basically about Moses and about his own glorification, and as you could see from those remarks at the groundbreaking for Shea Stadium, this was a very, very arrogant, self-absorbed man.
Now, let me ask you this. Tell me about the day with the whole parade and everything else leading up to Dodger Stadium.
Well, the morning of the day before the game, this is April 9th, there was a stadium dedication ceremony in front of City Hall, which is about a mile or so from Dodger Stadium, and there the mood is triumphant. And actually, though, ominously, one of the Los Angeles County supervisors who helped the stadium be built, who's a supporter of the stadium, turns to O'Malley when the opening ceremony is going on and says, "I'm looking forward to many years of tax revenues to the county of Los Angeles from the stadium." And in the end, the county of Los Angeles has benefited tremendously from the stadium. At this point, I think they've collected hundreds of millions of dollars in property tax revenue from the stadium, which they would not have had if it was a municipal stadium. And in fact, I also say in my book that over the first 10 years of operation, from 62 to 72 of Dodger Stadium, they paid more in property tax revenues than any other team in any other city in a municipal stadium paid in rent. So the financial gamble certainly paid off for the city of Los Angeles. So they have the parade, then they go up to the stadium, they have ceremonies there, they go on for quite some time. The stadium isn't even completely done. But then on April 10th, 1962, it opens with all the politicians who supported it, and even some who opposed it. John Holland is there. Ed Roybal is there to watch the stadium being opened. It's not a perfect opening. There are glitches. At one point, it was reported that the stadium turnstile counters were running backwards, meaning they weren't actually recording the tickets being taken. There was some incident where the press box was not guarded properly, and so a fan wandered into the press area, the club area, and tried to make a long distance phone call. So there are those kinds of things, and there's also sort of an urban legend that comes out of that opening day. The water fountains were not installed, and the urban legend became, well, O'Malley didn't want water fountains because he wanted to sell soft drinks and beer. But one of the advantages of doing the kind of research I did, the primary source research that I did, sitting with papers and looking at them one by one for hours and hours, is I actually discovered a series of memos in the papers that indicated that O'Malley actually did want water fountains and had actually contracted with the maintenance company that was in charge of that to put water fountains in, and they just didn't do it. And I've always thought that that was one of the laws of history that people who study history should be aware of. Sometimes things just get screwed up. They just get screwed up. It's not intentional. It's just people forget. They're human beings, and often that's how history works. And so the water fountains were installed within a week or two. But it's interesting that story seemed to have survived, and I heard it too, that O'Malley didn't want the water fountains because he wanted to sell soft drinks and beer. And it's just interesting as a historical researcher to come across a number of pieces of paper that just contradict that tell a different story. You don't always get that in historical research. You don't always get, as we say, the smoking gun. But in that instance, I actually saw it, and I remember looking at it when I was doing the research and saying, hey, this is very interesting. I'm looking at the answer to this question right now. It doesn't always work that way in historical research, but when it does, it's gratifying. So the stadium is built. It's opened. They play the Cincinnati Reds that day. The Dodgers lose and go on to have a memorable season in 1962, although not for the best reasons. Those of us who are baseball fans know that the Dodgers had a substantial lead going into the last week of the season against the Giants, but they just could not score runs, and I think they went down to I think they lost their last 4 games of the regular season, and I think they were shut out in two or three of them. I think it's either 3 out of 4 or 2 out of the last 3. It's 2 out of the last 3, and they end up going to a playoff with the Giants. They lose the first game, win the second, and have a 4-2 lead at Dodger Stadium going into the 9th of the final third game with the pennant in their reach, and just like 1951, they can't hold it. The Giants score 4 runs in the top of the 9th, and they win the pennant 6-4. So it's a real devastating way to end the first season of Dodger Stadium. But aesthetically and critically, the stadium is a tremendous success. The fans love it. The architectural critics love it. And it really almost becomes instantly an icon, not only of sports stadiums, but of modern architecture, because this is the first, or one of the very first modern stadiums in the sense that there are no obstructed views. It's built only for baseball. It's not multi-purpose. You don't have the high climbs to the upper deck because the stadium is built partially into the ground. It's immaculately clean. It's oriented towards families. The ticket prices are affordable. It's entertainment-oriented as much as competition-oriented, with the idea being like Disneyland. Everyone who comes to the stadium, even if the Dodgers lose, should have a good time, should be entertained. O'Malley understands that even though he has Sandy Koufax, he can't win every day. And for the days that they don't win, you want everyone to have a good time and be entertained, just like as in Disneyland. And, O'Malley looked very carefully and had his people look very carefully at the way Disneyland operated. He sent his executives down there to take a look at how they operated, and I think that's the way he wanted to operate as well. So although the 62 season ends in disappointment on the field, Dodger Stadium is well launched to be one of the most beloved ballparks in baseball. And, at this point, except for Wrigley and Fenway, the oldest, and I think over time people realize and appreciate the beauty of the stadium, the efficiency. There is no other stadium where you can look in one direction and see a downtown skyline, look in another direction and see the mountains, see flowers. It is a very, very special venue, as anyone who's ever been there can attest. And I do know that maybe about 15 or 20 years ago now, I'm looking at the book right now on my bookshelf. An author named, I think his name was Bob Wood, wrote a book about all the baseball stadiums that were extant at that time. I think this is a book from the 90s. It's called Dodger Dogs to Fenway Franks, and I'm looking at it right now on my bookshelf. It's written by Bob Wood, and he actually ranked all the stadiums, with 1 to 30, or however many. And not surprisingly, Dodger Stadium he ranked number 1. It's the best stadium in terms of the of the fan experience. And while this was a few years ago, I think I think it probably still holds up. That this was really the best place. I'm looking at the chapter here, and his subtitle for the chapter was Camelot. There are other chapters about other stadiums. The titles are much less flattering. The Kingdome for Seattle Mariners, his title is Let Me Out. Candlestick Park, San Francisco, Stick in the Mud. I'm looking to what he wrote about Shea Stadium. Pardon Me If I Smile. Yankee Stadium, The Great Escape. Three Rivers Stadium, is anybody out there? Well, Dodger Stadium, at least to him in the 90s, and I think it still remains for the people of Los Angeles, a great place to see a baseball game, although at this point the ticket prices are much higher. And for architects and for historians, really the epitome of modern architecture. Sleek, cool, beautiful lines, not just a baseball stadium, but really an exemplar of modern post-war architecture, and still a great place to see a game.
Hey, I mean, the only thing I have left to say about this is that the Hispanic community really did not come back or embrace Dodger Stadium until 1981, when Fernando Valenzuela becomes a pitcher.
Oh, yeah. Well, they were great Dodger fans before that. Because of, we talked about the Arechiga controversy, the Arechiga squatter controversy. There is a divided mind in the Latino community about the Dodgers. And, one thing that you have to learn when you become a historian is that sometimes contradictory ideas, contradictory facts even, appear, and you have to be reasonably comfortable with that. You can't say this is one thing or the other. I always tell my students history is rarely one thing or the other. And this is a good example of that, because the Latino community is still, at least parts of it, still upset over the demise of the Chavez Ravine community. But they are also big Dodger fans at the same time. And you would say, well, these two ideas contradict. Well, perhaps they do, but that's human existence. That's human life. That's history. You have to be able to hold those two contradictory ideas in your head and be comfortable with both of them. Now, it's true that once Fernando came along, certainly the Latino loyalty to the Dodgers was solidified, but it was there before then. Spanish language broadcasts, which were almost unheard of in 1958, were inaugurated when the Dodgers came to Los Angeles, and that helped quite a bit. And what I've noticed over the years is that while other Dodger fans come and go depending on how well they're doing, and certainly the recent McCourt years were very difficult ones for Dodger fans, the Latino fans stick with them. They are the most loyal group of Dodger fans over the years, and of course now they're being rewarded for their patience.
Some great time with you, Professor Podair. Let me ask you this: do you have anything to add that maybe we didn't cover in the 8 episodes that we did?
Well, the last thing I would say is that Dodger Stadium, and this was one of the themes of my book, was very important to the development of downtown Los Angeles. And it was in a sense, the first attempt to make Los Angeles' downtown a, shall we say, major league downtown. And I don't mean that just in the baseball sense. I mean that in the civic sense, in the national sense, in the world sense. to give Los Angeles a downtown like New York's, like Chicago's, like San Francisco. And after well over 50 years, people who go to downtown Los Angeles will see what I call a work in progress. It still does not rise to the level, Los Angeles' downtown, of those other cities that I mentioned, but it is definitely moving in that direction. And I think if Los Angeles does develop a downtown which is on the same level as those other cities, New York, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, that Dodger Stadium will be credited as the first step along that long road to a truly major league downtown.
You know, I mean, and it's always a work in progress with L.A. Something's always...
It always is. It's a city that's always becoming.
And it's weird because it's so spacious. Everything is done by the highway there. Yeah. But I think,
that's the other thing. They do have a subway. It's a developing system, and I think that's going to be the crucial element in not only making Los Angeles' downtown a better downtown, but the city generally. There has to be a way to get from, let's say, downtown Los Angeles. When I was doing my research a number of years ago, to get from downtown Los Angeles to, let's say, the UCLA campus in Westwood, which if there were a subway line running would have been easy, was almost nightmarish in terms of the traffic, in terms of the expense. I had to take a cab out there. In fact, I remember going out to UCLA from downtown on 2 consecutive days, back and forth, and the cab fare, this is a little before Uber and Lyft, the cab fare was almost as much money combined as my airfare from Appleton, Wisconsin to Los Angeles. It was just a huge amount of money. So that has to change, and I think it is changing. The problem with Los Angeles is that they had an efficient public transportation system, a system of urban trolleys, which were called the red cars, that they actually dismantled in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s because they thought they were just going to rely on the automobile, and that obviously did not work out. So now they're building up their public transportation system, but it may take another 30 or 40 years for them to catch up to where they were in the 1920s and 1930s, which is ironic. So they're heading in the right direction in terms of public transportation. There's now, in fact, been a proposal just recently to have a gondola line from Union Station to Dodger Stadium. That's about a mile and a half. A gondola line where you could get off the train at the Union Station, get on one of these gondolas, and they would take you to Dodger Stadium, which, of course, is not, it would be better if there were a subway, but that's going to be very, very difficult. But maybe that's the next best thing. I think the important thing is that the city of Los Angeles is now thinking in terms of public transportation, understanding that public transportation is really tied up with the future of the city. Otherwise, that city will just choke on its own traffic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people have exited Los Angeles in recent years. Back in the 70s, that was the place to go, but recently, yeah, it was. I mean, it grew from the third biggest city to the second biggest city to overtake Chicago. But now I'm hearing it's too pricey, it's too expensive, it's too congested. Where do you see the city going in the next 50 years? And do you ever see them considering to rebuild Dodger Stadium or just leave it intact?
Well, I am actually optimistic about the future of Los Angeles. I find it to be a fascinating place. It's with all its problems, when it's 10 degrees below zero here in Wisconsin, if you ask me whether I'd like to move to Los Angeles, the answer would be yes. It is expensive, but it is not as expensive, for example, as San Francisco, which is outrageously expensive at this point. And I think that what Los Angeles has going for it in terms of neighborhoods, in terms of prices, is that it still has places to expand. San Francisco is very cut off in many ways geographically. There aren't that many other places to go. I think Los Angeles, if it has anything, it has land. It has geography. And I'm hoping hopeful that with the rise of public transportation in the future, it will be easier to live in Los Angeles in places that are served by public transportation that we don't even think about today as places that could be residential. So I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic about the future of Los Angeles. It's a fascinatingly diverse place, and I've always said that if New York City was going to be the city of the 20th century in America, Los Angeles could be the city of the 21st. If the American experiment is going to work, if the American pluralistic experiment is going to work anywhere, I think Los Angeles is its laboratory. So I am optimistic about that. Now, as to Dodger Stadium, I'm also optimistic about it. And one of the reasons I am is because of what happened, not to Dodger Stadium, but to Fenway Park. Some of our listeners may recall a time maybe 10 or 15 years ago where there was a big push to tear down Fenway Park and build a modern stadium somewhere else in Boston or maybe even on the site of Fenway. And what we heard then was, and I remember reading this, the proponents of that said, Fenway Stadium is structurally unsound, it's falling apart, it has no future, it can't be saved because it's just too old and too decrepit. Well, what we see now is the Red Sox double down on Fenway. They rehabilitated it. They built those great seats over the wall, which maybe one day before I pass from this world I will be able to sit in. And they really made it a great place to be, an expensive place to be, but a great place to be. And now there's no more talk about tearing down Fenway Park. Well, there have been in the past there's been talk about, well, Dodger Stadium has served its purpose. It's not in the most accessible place for public transportation. Maybe we should move it downtown. But I think that in recent years, and maybe my book has contributed to that, people are starting to appreciate how beautiful the stadium is, how even if you started all over, you couldn't get that, and how its location, while difficult, to get to with public transportation, is still a unique and a beautiful one. With, if you stick it in downtown, you're going to lose the view of the mountains, or you probably will lose the view of the mountains. If you stick it somewhere else, maybe you'll lose the view of downtown. So it's really in a perfect spot aesthetically, and so I think that there's nothing structurally unsound about the stadium at all. Obviously, it's a lot younger than Fenway. It's not falling down. It's not falling apart. It's bones, as they say. It has good bones as a building. O'Malley built it to last, and I think it will be in the same place where it is now for many years, and it will be, part of going to a Dodger game, part of being a Dodger fan is walking into that stadium, which I think is a very special place. So I think that the drive to build something in the middle of downtown, let's say, where the Staples Center is, in the middle of downtown instead of on the edge of downtown, which is where Chavez Ravine and Dodger Stadium is, I think that's dissipated. And I think people are into Dodger Stadium being where it is and what it is for the long haul.
Yeah, I have to agree. And, that's where we're going to end our inquiry. And hang on a second, Jerald, and
Sure.
I'm going to finish up the show. We can get this at Amazon, we know. We could get this at Princeton's press over there.
Right.
And they can go to you. You have a website up, don't you? Or it's on the
I have a website. I don't sell the book myself on the website, but certainly Amazon or the Princeton site, and the Princeton site, the Princeton University Press site has a lot of information on the book, and I've really enjoyed working with Princeton on this book, and so in the sense that I would always tell people to try to buy a book at an independent bookstore. I love independent bookstores, not Barnes and Noble. My advice would be to see if you could buy the book on the Princeton site and not give Jeff Bezos another $30.
Yeah, of course. Well, he doesn't need the money.
Yeah, he doesn't need the money.
He doesn't need the money. What's your next project, sir?
I might be working on a longer history of the United States in the 20th century. Actually, I'm thinking about doing that, doing a big book about the United States in the 20th century. So not necessarily a sports book, but although in the back of my mind I'm always thinking about, it would be wonderful to write a history of baseball. It's been done on a number of occasions, and of course done brilliantly by Harold Seymour. In multi-volume, but maybe a one-volume book about the history of baseball. But it's funny, the choice between, let's say, doing a book about the history of the United States and a book about the history of baseball. Maybe they're the same thing.
Well, it would be the same thing. And you know something? Doing a series right now with Martin Babbitt, and he combined the two, the history of baseball. It's called Our National Pastime. And, and Martin Babbitt, and he's in the University of Colorado. His book is about the historical time periods, the 20s and the 30s, and going back to the 1800s, and how baseball was part of that era. You might want to take a look at that book.
Okay. So is it a series of books, or is it
just one volume? One volume.
Oh, okay.
You might want to take a look at that, at least for reference. And hey, when you publish your next book, give me a call. We'll have it no matter what it is, because I have Greg Brady coming on my show next week from the Brady Bunch. Barry Williams.
Really?
Yeah, people.
I remember him. He must be. How old is he now? He's maybe 50, 55, or
62.
Maybe older. 62. Wow, we're all getting old.
Yeah, and he's going to be on the show.
The oldest one, right? He was the oldest one.
He was the oldest. He also played. Before that. He also played, he had bit parts on Gomer Pyle. No one knows who Gomer. Yeah, he had bit parts in the 1960s. He pretty much grew up as a kid actor, and he got lucky with the Brady Bunch. And we're going to talk about what he's doing now. He's in Missouri, and he's on a band. He's in a band. He plays guitar, and he does all the specials, and of course he comes to folks like me to give interviews, and he has a young family. I know he had two children late in life. One when he was 52, and when he was 57, he had a kid. Oh,
good luck to him.
Oh yeah, I had a kid at 37, and it's like now they're going to be 11.
Even that, yeah. At 52, 57, he's a brave man indeed.
Oh dear God, for me it's almost like, okay, I'm going to be 48 at the end of the month, so I got another 7 years with you monkeys, and then after that, at 55, you're going to college, and I'm taking...
You're going to college? I'm washing my hands with you, right?
Well, that's it. I'm taking 6 months off and going around the world by myself and keeping my wife home, because that'll mark 30 years I'm with her. And, it's like, I got to start out and get out and do what I need to do. I've been a stay-home dad for a long time. I do my whole law practice from here. I do my radio stations. And, I created my house into my own den and office and radio station. So for me, I got to get off this.
You don't have any commuting time at all.
Yeah, my commute's from my bed to my couch. That's about it.
We should all be so lucky.
And with that, sir, let me end the show. I'll talk to you for about another minute, and God bless you. It was so much fun doing this. Really a high point of the whole year, you being on the show, you winning the Seymour Medal Award. It is so rewarding to have gone through this material with you. Enjoyed every second of it. Never was a dull moment. You kept it going.
Yep.
And hey, as always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Professor Podair, for being on the show. And in the words of one of my, heroes, Edward L. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.